Okay, we're going to try this. This is the third part in this thing I call usage rights. I don't know how well this is going to go. I just made these slides up a while ago and I haven't actually tried going through them, so it will be terrible. But anyway, I've got lots of other things I want to actually talk about. But I wanted to do this. It's going to come in, I think it's going to be relevant because I think the next video or the video after the next will be about my thoughts on AI and a particular concern I have about the future. And I think I'll lead back to these as a possible way of making a better society instead of universal basic income, which I generally think is a terrible idea because it doesn't make any sense. But it could make sense in the right context. But anyway, we're going to go into this. So in the last two usage rights videos, I talked about carbon credits, so individual carbon credit schemes, and then just extending that to general resources that sort of flow, or they are, continually supplied and can easily be divided up into little tiny bits. So for example, oil out of the ground, every year you extract a certain amount and you can divide that up quite neatly. Another thing might actually be talking about AI is compute rights. So maybe there's like a global compute resource, and in the absence of having marketable labor, you might get allocated usage rights to compute power, which is kind of like what some people were saying for like what they might call UBI for AI in a little way, but we'll come back to that in the next video. But anyway, can we apply this to land? Now I think land is a big issue in our society. It's like property investment, as far as I'm concerned, is a cancer on our economic system, and it's not a good thing. So one of these things is, can you apply it to land and does it help things? I don't know if I'm going to get to the point that does it help, but I think you can work it on land, and I think it is a valuable thing. And I think also this will tie directly into the AI talk about what happens when your labor no longer is worth anything economically, not worth anything in general. But anyway, we'll come back to that. So first off, that was my recap already. So as a recap, pollution rights, or whatever rights you're doing, extraction rights, are given to individuals, so not to companies, corporations, etc. And these are automatically sold via a market in general, though of course you can choose to abstain to sell your credits you get each year, or you can directly gift them, or you can sell them on an alternative market. And I think this just generally works way better because it puts it on the individuals, it makes it real for them, it gives them an incentive to reduce their consumption of things, and so on and so on and so on. So you could apply it. You could also add in compute as another possibility in the future. I think in the last one I was going to talk about the more abstract things, and I think compute was the thing I really wanted to talk about, but I didn't actually mention that. So anyway, so the big question is, can we apply this system to a resource that is more fixed? So the thing with land is it's not a resource that you get every year. It doesn't flow out of the ground. It's not something you're extracting. It's just there, and it doesn't really change in general. Like, we're going to assume that the land, we're not talking about what the land can be used for. We're talking primarily about the land itself just being there. So it's not really used up, and it tends to be divided up more coarsely. It's lumpy. Especially if you've designed the system around the idea of just particular private ownership. So people's properties, unless you live like in a very set little grid area, can often be quite all over the show. And I'll come back to that as to why that might be a concern. But this again is, first off, let's start with the theoretical idea, and so it's a sort of way of understanding possibly why society is unfair to people. Another consideration with this, of course, is that land has different uses. So there's farmland, there's roads, there's housing, industrial, schools, public goods, conservation land, and so on. So land is not just one thing. So we may have to have different schemes for different types of land. We'll get to that. Maybe, I don't think this is not going to be, I don't think, a long video. So this is how I would do this. Again, the individuals get a set amount of land usage credits, so we could call them occupation rights. So you might get enough credits. We'll just start off with the basic idea. You might get enough credits for like 3 acres of land or 1 hectare of land every year. And remember, this allocation is sort of like your share of the entire society. So it's not just your rights to your land to live on. So you're not saying that this person needs for like a hectare of land to live for one individual. It's just saying that if you factor in roads and parts of the schools and hospitals and all the other things that society requires, and factories and farms and all of that, if you add up your fair proportion of that, maybe it comes to a hectare, maybe it comes to 2 hectares. So you get these credits again every year. So it's your right to use that amount of land for a year. You could, there's always the big thing. Well, before we get to the last line, again, I always have to reiterate is that there's a slight thing. It's like, how do you do this? Because you don't want companies having to get these rights within a very short period of time. So you might get rights to use lands, but the people who actually need those rights may not actually have to use them for a few. There's like going to be a division between when people first start getting rights. So you either have the case where people get rights and that right is for a particular year. So in year 2025, I might get rights for 2027, so that there's 2 years in between for companies or organizations or whoever to obtain those rights, so they can be on the market for 2 years. Or you could just say there are general rights that last for whenever, and you get this many this year. And so in theory, maybe you can accumulate. It might not work for land rights. It might have a different dynamic with land rights, but with other things you might say, well, this year I'm not going to sell my polluting rights, all of them, so I might sell them the next year. So the next year there might be an increased amount of ability to pollute because you saved up your rights and then you gave them away another year. But of course, over the time, it equals out. Like, well, you polluted more one year, but you polluted less the year before. With land, this is slightly different, of course. So that's one difference. But the big difference, of course, is that in this case here, the individual is probably expected to be able to directly use some of these credits. So in the previous example is with pollution rights, carbon credits, and with like rights to oil and whatever. Those are generally being sold off to corporations that are actually doing the extraction or the polluting. A individual themselves would be very unlikely to actually use those directly. But in the case of land, they are almost certainly likely to use them if they own a residential home or they occupy a piece of land. Then they're going to possibly or quite likely use some of their own credits for that. So that should be fine because you get these allocations and they'd be handled by a central ledger or whatever, a system that identifies that you've got this many credits, and then you have to say, well, I own this bit of land and then this land requires this many credits. And so those credits would automatically be transferred off to whatever authority that says you need those credits in order to be on that land. So that would work out fine. But of course, if you own a huge amount of land, so this goes back to why this makes things a bit fairer. If you own the huge amounts of land, then you're taking away land from other people. And so in that case, you can still own that large amount of land just because you want to have your own personal park to do whatever in. But you have to compensate the people that you are taking the land away from at a market price. And if they choose not to give out their credits, then ultimately people who own large land holdings may not be able to do that because they will face huge fines for having insufficient credits. So just going over things again. So an individual has a set of occupation rights each year and a set of land that needs those rights per year. So your own personal allocation, and then you sell the rest. So again, it's going to go off to all of the other organizations that require land usage rights but don't get them because they're corporations, they're not individuals, so they have to buy them on the market. So some individuals, of course, might actually just use some of their own allocations. So maybe they have a larger residential area, in which case they'll keep it all. Or they'll have farmland and they may use it for their own farmland. And some individuals, of course, may use very little of their own because they may have a very small area. They may have a very tiny apartment and the land area is just a small fraction of the footprint of the building they're in. Or they may have none because they may be homeless. In which case they're going to be selling all of their allocation, and so there's an incentive, possibly people will have smaller houses or to be more compacted, but also that you're being compensated if for whatever reason society has led you to not have a home. Then you're going to be compensated for that because you're going to have more credits to sell. So I would say this is gets it, it helps like people, a justification for giving homeless people money. This is a sort of laid out why this is actually the correct thing to do in some cases. So individuals that need more than their allocation, or organizations that need land directly, would need to purchase or obtain those credits. So those organizations would just include general businesses, farms, general public use, land, roads, and general community buildings, religious groups as well, which may sound all kind of unfair. But remember how this is going to work. Say you're a business and you either own the land that the business is on. The business either owns the land, in which case they have to come up with the credit, so they have to buy that. So there's just an additional business cost which you are supposed to pass on to the consumers of your business. Or you rent the land, in which case the owner of the land would pass on the extra costs they have to use to buy those land rights to the business, and again the business just passes those on. So I have to go over and over and over again, it is important that the businesses pass on those costs, because that's how the market will work better. It will show the businesses that use more land or more resources as being more expensive, and it will incentivize you to use less of these resources. But also the fact is, if you're using what actually has to be used, remember that the people, the individuals are selling these credits on the market and they are receiving the proceeds of those credits. So if those businesses have to buy those credits and then they pass those costs on to the individuals, if the individuals are using their fair share, they are not going to be out of pocket because they are compensated the amount that of the extra costs that they have to incur. And if they are using less than they are actually selling, they are getting compensated, and if they are using more because they are taking other people's resources, they are going to have to pay more out of their own pocket. So in a normal system, if you're using your fair amount, you are not going to be out of pocket, even though these companies, these farmers, everybody has to pay extra money because you're compensated extra money. So I don't know how many times I have to go over it, but I just want to make sure this is the most important part of it. But of course, most people might accept that businesses and farms and such like, that might make sense for this. But the rest of these, I think people might have some issues with. One of this, of course, is general public use land, so roads, parks, community buildings, buildings in support of like local government or central governments and things like this. You might say, well, they should be excluded. And you could argue that these things should be excluded. I would not exclude roads, but you might argue that certain buildings, certain things that are just naturally for the society as a whole can be excluded. But again, if you include that, it makes an incentive for all of these organizations to manage their usage of resources and their usage of land in a more frugal way, or to optimize their use of these things, especially when it comes to roads. So with roads, this is important. So I'm a big person who believes that roads are well undercharged for what they really do. They use up a lot of land that would otherwise be used for other things. They could be used for farming, they could be used for housing, they could be used for just areas for natural drainage. So I would say one thing about parks, of course, maybe parks can be excluded to a degree because parks could include functions like acting as reservoirs for flooding and things like this. but then again, if you include these things in there, I think there's arguments both ways. It doesn't seem like there should be, but I think if you're trying to get the optimal, again, with all of these things, I'm trying to create a system that's an emergent system that creates a way of optimizing your resource usage. So there might be an argument for this, but definitely for roads, so that we can start seeing how much, if you use a road for one thing, then you have to compensate the people who would be otherwise using that road for farming or housing or whatever. And this creates a sort of market which will lead to that sort of a more efficient usage of these things. And it will probably show that most roads take up a lot of our resources. And if we actually had to pay directly for these things, it would probably be too expensive to live a car-obsessed society. And religious groups, I am going to say that they should. If you have a religious group, that should be fine. I mean, you have to pay for buildings and all that kind of stuff. If you believe in something, you should be willing to put this thing in, because otherwise your religion, if it happens to like having lots of buildings, is being unfairly supported by society if you're taking away land that would otherwise be used for something else. Again, all these things you can just fudge it. You can argue whichever way you want. Hopefully the general idea is acceptable, and the finer details you can discuss. I would say this does not include things like reserve land, so conservation land should not be included in this. It's a separate issue. That's not land for humans, so it shouldn't be part of this. This is for land for humans. Land that's not for humans should be entirely separate and just to be itself. And so some land will be just simply unusable for whatever reason. And of course, we're not talking about the oceans or lakes here. They can be handled in a separate way. So renters, if you rent a property, you do not need to provide your usage rights. The owner does. But the owner then, of course, would pass on the costs to the renter. But the renter could pay those rights off as part of their rent, of course. So the other way around is that they could use their rights directly and just pass them on to the owner so that they have the usage rights. And then they wouldn't be paying any extra rent, but they would be using up part of their allocation. Or the owner could buy off the market, pass the cost on to the renter, and so on and so on and so on. Hopefully these equate to the same financial outcome in either case. Either the renter loses some income from not selling them on the market but giving them directly, or they pay extra but they also get compensated off the market, so they end up in the same position as they were in the first place. So as I just said, they should be covered. So this will be an extra cost in rates and taxes that are covered but this should be covered by the rights of your usage rights, but then there will be sort of like an incentive to lower the costs and how much roads you're using, for example. Parks might be the one thing where you don't want that, because parks is like a public good, and you don't want to have a sort of force making parks as small as possible. You want people to have as many green spaces as possible. So, there's room for this. So the aim is to optimize the usage and get the true cost to society for roads and the infrastructure around the roads, which I think is the one thing, because we're always doing things like we have to subsidize public transport, and this because we are failing to really, like, I'm a big believer in that you should put as much as possible toll roads. All roads should be paid for by tolls or by fuel taxes or those kind of things, or road user charges, which I will talk about in another video, and why the obvious argument is that that's going to hurt the poor. Well, in this case here, I'm trying to give a way that doesn't hurt the poor, because remember, it's you're getting proceeds from the sale of these things. But in some other cases, we'll have to make different sort of arguments. I'm going to come back and say that I think sometimes these arguments don't hold up, or I would be a bit wary about the idea that they necessarily hurt the poor. To actually make people pay more doesn't necessarily mean that they end up materially worse off. It just might seem that way, but maybe it's not the case. But anyway, and so yeah, charity, I feel that there should be, you can have opportunity for flexibility. Maybe you could say that charities or religious groups could get an allocation of rights too. I would say no, but there's, you can argue have an argument about that. I don't think it gets in the way of the whole. I don't think I've got around to. I'm running out of time here. I don't think I've got around to talking about prisoners on this, so I have to do a video about prisoners. So the thing here is we have to differentiate land. I know I said time frames, so not just have one form of credit. Obviously, farmland, rural land is different from residential land. You've got a lot more infrastructure in a residential area. You have or an industrial area. You have sewage and electricity and all this kind of stuff. You can't compare them to the two different things. So you might have different classes. You might get a certain number of rural credits, a certain number of residential credits, a certain number of industrial credits. So you might need time to maintain stability. So the rights could be allocated for a number of years before they start. So you might say, well, I'm going to start getting credits, and they're being allocated for in 2025, but they won't get started to be used until 2030. But so people have time in the meantime to buy those credits, but the actual scheme doesn't really start until a bit closer. But just that you need a bit of time. This is a huge shift to society. So in the time that we're coming up to, where I'm sure that society is going to face lots and lots of different things that are going to radically change, this might be the time to do something this radical. Who knows? But anyway, so we've got the problems. This is an unfair burden on people. So lots of elderly people, they still live in their family house. They don't have any children. So this is a huge burden on people who live in these houses. I mean, ultimately, an elderly person should not be living in a big house with using up lots of land, because they're taking that away from everybody else. It's just that they happen to, they're baby boomers or whatever, and they just happen to have that. You can fudge this in. You can start off in saying that the elderly who are in the situation can have some extra rights to help compensate, but over time, if this house gets sold on to people, that there's no special exemption for this particular piece of land. It's just for the people when the scheme started. So you're trying to get people out of that big family house. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who has parents who have both lived in large sections of land into their elderly times. This would suddenly be a huge burden. So I don't want to upend society completely, but this is not the way that you ideally want society. You don't want people living on this huge land when everybody else needs land for houses. You don't want them moving out to the middle of nowhere just because you had this nice piece of land that you didn't want to give up until you died. But again, we got to be fair in trying to do this as nicely as possible. Land is also messy, so existing land divisions are not easily altered. The problem with this, of course, is that you might have there's a cost to having a larger area of land, which is that you have to use more credits of your own, so that's a loss of income for you. And if you have a section that is just a big lawn that you mainly just mow, but it doesn't actually give you any use, it might have looked nice before, but suddenly when that becomes a case for a loss of income. Of course, you can subdivide and things, but smaller sections, they just might not be able to subdivide them up. But then you've suddenly got this area of land you just don't really use, but it's not big enough to actually sell or use for any other reason. So that just changes the market for housing. In some cases, a smaller land area might be more valuable than a larger land area. In certain areas. So because of the way that land has been divided, not in this sort of context, it's going to make things a little bit weird. And so it's just way too, so what you might say, it's just way too hard to implement. I'm going to say, no, it's not. The way that I would do this is I would start off with a carbon credit scheme. And once you've got people used to the idea of a market, then that would be, you'd be able to move on to this a bit much more easier. So this is that will be laying the groundwork for what I think, this thing here, I think, is one of the major causes of inequity in society, which is how we own land. And of course the other problem is this would basically kill the property market as an investment market, which people might dislike, but I'm going to say actually it would kill the property market as an investment market. Is actually a positive point. So homeless people are to a degree compensated. So if you, for whatever reason, society has forced you out of a home, you are compensated because you have extra money coming to you. People and organisations are encouraged to use less space, so these are the positive points. People work to own their land at the moment. This is unfair, right? We use labour to pay the cost of owning a piece of land, or we have inheritance, which these things create an unfair society as far as you should exchange your labour for other people's labour, or, for example, maybe, I'm not disagreeing that you're exchanging your labour always for labour. You might do for other forms of capital. You might, like, if you're borrowing money, then I have no problems with you paying interest on it to pay it back. So that's not a form of labour. But if you're exchanging your labour to own a fair bit of land or a fair bit of resources, that is unfair. And this whole scheme is meant to address that particular unfairness in our society. So this is me being a left libertarian, which is like an egalitarian but market-based. So you still get to own specific land. So this would, from selling unused rights, open up land to society. So yes, I think I'm going to run out of time. So I'm going to finish this. I've only got one more. Oh no, this is the last page. I forgot to mention the really most important thing, which was did I not print it out? Which was the idea. I think I'm missing a page, which I was going to talk about the commons and the anti-commons. So basically, if you abstain from selling your unused rights, then you're forcing land to be opened up for sale. So if there are a group of people who feel like they're being disadvantaged, you can just abstain. There were more pages. There were pages about how you might incorporate this into different sort of political views in society. We might have to do a part 2 on this. But I will talk briefly about the commons and the anti-commons. So the problem with the commons, right, is that if we all have land in common, then you don't use the land properly because there's no sort of sense of ownership over these things. And the classic way of doing this is to have property rights to counter this. And so this scheme is allowing you to have property rights. So it's allowing you to have bits of land that you use for yourself and that you can keep using, and you can justify. But then you have this problem of the anti-commons, which is if you give people property rights, then they hoard that land and they don't sell it and they don't use it because they want to wait to the prices, they can, it's a scarce resource, so then they can sell it later on at a higher price or whatever, or they can just abstain for whatever reason that they want to, or they can, whatever problems. And this again counters that, because there is a cost for you to do that. If you're not using land efficiently or well, then you're paying the price of having to compensate other people. And of course, if people really disagree, they can refuse to sell their credits to people like the people who are doing this. So like in the previous market, I mentioned that you could actually make conditions on the sale of your thing. So in this case here, you might make a condition: I am not going to sell my usage rights to people who farm animals, for example. If I'm an animal rights person, I would say I don't want to sell that. Or I might say I love eating meat, so I'm not going to sell it to farmers who farm vegetables, for example. I'm just going to show those vegetarians and vegans what's what, and I'm going to sell to meat only. So there's a sort of weird democracy going on there as well, and it works really well, I think, for land. But again, it sort of pushes you away from not using land productively, because you are forced, because you have to pay to compensate other people for the fact that you're choosing to do that. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to finish it there because my camera only records 29 minutes and I'm almost out of time. So I was going to come back and talk about a few other things, which is about, if you disagree with the scheme, I would actually argue that it's possible to choose a different system within this system. It can act as a sort of meta system, but I think that will have to be a talk for another day. But anyway, thanks for watching this video, and hopefully the next one will be interesting as well.